Tonight, Brian Mulroney is being remembered for his dedication, his passion, his love for this country.
I always tried to do what I thought would be right for Canada.
Politicians and average Canadians alike are reflecting on his legacy and on word that Canada's 18th Prime Minister has died. Mulroney's tenure was at points controversial, but also consequential, both in Canada and around the world. Joining me now to look back at Brian Mulroney's legacy, a special at issue, Andrew Coyne, Tonda MacCharles, and Rob Russo. Thank you all for doing this. Andrew, I'm going to start with you. What do you think Brian Mulroney changed about this country? What was the most significant change he brought to Canada?
Oh, I think by all accounts, it would be the free trade agreement. People have to remember, before free trade, if you proposed free trade with the United States, people would look at you like you had two heads. How could we possibly survive against the colossus to our south? It was obviously a big policy change, but it was as much a change in our outlook, in our sense of ourselves, our confidence in ourselves. It's remarkable that he attempted it, of course, having run against it for the leadership. And being by nature, I think, more of a cautious pragmatist. But I think what you can really say about Mulroney is when circumstances require that you make a big bet, when you push in all your chips, he did. And that's a remarkable testament that he was able to do that.
And that's sort of who he was, Tonda, wasn't it? He put all his chips on the table if he believed in what he was doing.
No incrementalist, right? He's not the conservative that Stephen Harper once was, in the sense that he took big chances, big leaps, as Andrew said, and not just in the constitutional sphere, but in the economic sphere, in the environmental sphere, on the world stage. And so his legacy spans a whole range of files. But yet, when you talk to people tonight, some of his, then arch enemies and political rivals and his friends, everybody remembers him as the person, the consummate politician with skill and acumen who reached out to people.
And how did that contribute to his success, Rob, as someone who covered him?
He was relentless in establishing relationships. Andrew talked about the relationship with the United States. It fundamentally changed even before free trade. And in fact, we got to free trade because he had an extraordinary relationship with U.S. presidents that Canadian prime ministers had stiff-armed, were wary of, or incapable of establishing before he got there, to the point where the chiefs of staff for both Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush used to say, could you please allow me to deal with Canada? Because Reagan would say, we have to do something for Brian. So this was a man who knew the value of the relationship, whether it was at the caucus level when he was at 12% and his caucus never left him, or at the summit of global affairs. He had those relationships, maintained them, and was able to advance his interests because of them. And in some cases, those relationships also turned on him and caused him some of his biggest miseries.
Andrew, he tried all those things and, as Rob said, had good relationships. Are there lessons there and certainly he tried to give advice to people, but are there lessons there that other leaders should be taking from Mulroney, and what would they be, do you think?
For good and ill. Yes, I mean, he was adept at building up political capital. He certainly, in that first election, won 211 seats, but he was also willing to spend it as the case may be. Now, some of those risks were probably not worth taking. I think Meech Lake was ill-advised, and the country is probably better off for it not having succeeded. But if you never try, you're never going to succeed. If you don't take any risks, you're not going to have much to show for it. And so to see a conservative prime minister in particular tackling those kinds of big things that we really have sort of forgotten, I think, certainly on the conservative side, of really trying to actually change things rather than just incrementalism. I think that's a remarkable thing as an example to hold up that other conservative leaders in particular can emulate.
Tonda?
Look, I'm struck by a common thread through all his years and all the big projects he worked on, and that was he had also a supreme confidence in his own ability of persuasion and his ability to persuade his rivals that his way was right. I first encountered Brian Mulroney in 1985 when he bravely sort of marched out onto the lawn of Parliament to confront a group of seniors who were protesting his plan to de-index their pensions. And Mulroney thought he could win that battle. Well, that battle was he was trumped in that match by a little tiny senior named Solange Denis, but also that he dialed back his decision to de-index pensions. That gave actually rise to a young Conservative staffer, Stephen Harper, who became very disillusioned with Brian Mulroney's conservatism brand, who went back to Alberta and later went on to be a key player in the Reform Party and the modern-day Conservative Party, which is not Brian Mulroney's Conservative Party, a very different party.
The counterexample would be from the 1988 election, which was fought over free trade, which they initially tried to low bridge, as they say. They tried to make it like it was no big deal. And they weren't getting very far, and John Turner scared the pants off of people. And the turning point really was he ran into two elderly protesters, I think it was in Victoria, BC, who were heckling him during his speech. And he said, look, if you let me finish my speech, I'll sit down and debate with you. And he did, and the cameras were rolling and everything else. And I think it really changed the whole tenor at that point. People could look at that and go, okay, at last we know what Brian Mulroney believes in. He really seems to believe in this free trade deal.
Rob?
You know, I'm struck by a couple of other things. Tonda was saying earlier about how he alienated Stephen Harper. Stephen Harper and every Conservative leader after him wore a very well-worn path in the carpet to Brian Mulroney's Westmount home to seek his advice. Every Conservative leader afterwards, or Conservative aspirant, went to look for advice from Brian Mulroney. And why? Because he had the secret sauce. Conservatives, really after the conscription debate in the First World War, Conservatives were a hiccup of history when they were elected in Canada between the early part of the century and 1984. He made people realize in the Conservative Party that you had to deal with Quebec, you had to embrace Quebec, you had to speak to Quebec in their own language, in French, and you had to embrace Quebec culture as part of Canada if you wanted to succeed as a Conservative Party. And I think every Conservative leader has tried that since. So he was consequential in terms of the place of Quebec in the country. Even with the failure of Meech Lake, I would say, a lot of what was in Meech Lake has come to pass in many, many ways, whether you agreed with it or not. It sees itself as a distinct society, primarily in French. That's all because of the carpentry that was hammered by Brian Mulroney.
Well, I was listening to Lucien Bouchard, who he apparently has reconciled with on Radio-Canada today, and he said that one of the things that people didn't understand about him was how sensitive a man he was. And I wonder, Andrew, without getting into the psychology of Brian Mulroney, whether there were things that stood in his way because of some of that, and because he valued these personal relationships and things that he didn't get to do because of that.
I think that was part of his difficulty politically was he needed to be loved too much. And people, I think the public could sense that. There was a kind of an unctuousness to him, a trying too hard to please kind of quality that, unfairly perhaps, but politics is an unfair business, people kind of recoiled from it. So he was in some ways supremely self-confident, but I think there was an insecurity to underlay it.
Tonda?
You know, when I spoke to Clyde Wells tonight, the Newfoundland Premier who confronted him over the Meech Lake Accord, and basically is Mulroney and David Peterson blamed Clyde Wells for its failure, but it's a more complex story than that. We don't have time for. But Clyde Wells, said that he always knew that Brian Mulroney had at the heart of his objectives a better Canada. He was dedicated to the country, and I don't think anyone really ever questioned that. Even when he was he left office, with low opinion numbers in the public opinion polls, and Tonight, all the reviews you're hearing of his legacy, it all speaks to he had a firm idea, and it was to better Canada. And I don't think that is anything anyone will take away from him.
No matter what kinds of challenges he put in front of him himself too, Rob, because he did that to himself sometimes too with his choices.
Yes. I think both Tonda and Andrew raised an interesting point about who he was as a human being. He was, I think, the first son of a working class father to become prime minister. That led to no end of insecurities, I'm sure. But what a wonderful subject to cover as a reporter. A swashbuckling, rollicking, warts and all prime minister who was going to make big bets. And it was just a joy to cover this guy, even when you felt the Arctic gale, as many of us did, from Mulroney when he was mad at you. He really, really cared about what reporters thought of him. So as a journalist, as a young journalist in particular, fascinating subject and a wonderful subject to cover as well.
Yeah, and a man who I think we all agree believed in his vision for Canada and was willing to do an awful lot for it, including make some big personal sacrifices as well. Thank you all for your reflections on him tonight and what you knew about him and covering him. I appreciate it very much. Andrew, Tonda, and Rob. Thanks, guys.